you, Senator Cruz. If you have a question, if you could write it down on a card and hold it up, I'll come over to you. We have one question, Senator Cruz. Before we get to that, though, I think there's some very special guests here you may want to introduce. I happen to see them come in.
There are indeed. I'm very proud to introduce my best friend in the whole world, my wife, Heidi. And our two little girls, Caroline and Catherine, who are 7 and 4. Caroline, wave, sweetie.
Nice. Thank you for joining us. So the first question, Senator.
And I will make a quick observation. I am so grateful our girls look like their mother.
I think a lot of fathers are. There is a direct relationship between the government and the people, where you see effects of the D.C. dysfunction in all aspects of government, even locally. How, as president, will you reestablish an atmosphere of bipartisanship?
You know, Washington is broken right now. And it's broken because I've said many times the biggest divide we've got politically is not between Democrats and Republicans. The biggest divide we have politically is between career politicians in Washington in both parties and the American people. I wrote a book a couple of months ago called A Time for Truth, where I talked about what I call the Washington cartel. The Washington politicians that get in bed with lobbyists and special interests and grow and grow and grow government. And if we're going to turn around what's wrong in Washington, we've got to have leaders willing to take on the Washington cartel. Now, we've seen how to do that. Now, it's interesting. The Republican primary, there are a whole lot of candidates talking about taking on Washington. In that last debate, you had 11 candidates standing on that stage talking about they're going to take on Washington. I think the natural next question is, okay, great. Show me when you've ever actually done so. And I don't have to point back to 2013 when I was leading the fight against Obamacare. Or to 2014 when I was leading the fight against President Obama's illegal and unconstitutional executive action. But I can point to this past week. You know, every candidate on that stage said they oppose funding Planned Parenthood. And they oppose the Iran deal. Well, this past week in Washington, I've been leading the fight to stop Planned Parenthood funding and to stop the Iran deal. And I have a simple question for the other very fine men and women running for the Republican nomination. Where were they? Not a single one of them showed up for that fight. I would have loved to have seen 11 Republican candidates for president showing up in Washington and saying, Mitch McConnell and John Boehner don't fund Planned Parenthood. And yet not a one of them was there. And you want an example. How do you break the Washington cartel? The best example we've seen is in 1980, the Reagan Revolution, that came from the American people, stood up to Washington and changed the path we're on. That's how we change Washington, is it's got to come from we the people.
Excellent. Thank you, Senator. So I'll get to as many of these questions as we can. Next question comes, what would you do to devolve power back to the states?
A fantastic question. You know, the simplest and best answer is follow the Constitution. Listen, I am passionate about the Constitution going back to literally when I was a child. As a teenager, I was part of a group called the Constitutional Corroborators that memorized the Constitution in short mnemonic form. In college, I wrote my senior thesis on the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Constitution. Before I was in the Senate, I founded and led the Center for 10th Amendment Studies at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. You look at the 10th Amendment, what it says. I'm actually reminded, I'll give you a great illustration of what the 10th Amendment says. A couple of weeks ago, I was on the Stephen Colbert Show. Not exactly a friendly forum for conservatives. I actually asked my team, if they never saw me again, to please send in the search and rescue teams. But, the first few minutes with Colbert, we joked, we had some fun. And then Colbert's politics are not hard to figure out. He immediately jumps in, gay marriage, what's wrong with Republicans on gay marriage? And my response was very simple. I said, listen, under the Constitution, gay marriage is a question for the states. Now, Colbert's audience, being Colbert's audience, immediately begins booing. Now, to Colbert's credit, he actually asked them, look, he's my guest, don't boo him. And Colbert responded and said, but Ted, marriage is found nowhere in the Constitution. And I turned to him and said, Stephen, exactly. And if it ain't in the Constitution, under the 10th Amendment, it's a question for the states to decide. And then I turned to the audience and I said, look, why would y'all want 5 unelected lawyers in Washington deciding every important public policy issue? If you care about an issue, convince your fellow citizens. Let's have 320 million Americans decide at the ballot box. That's called democracy. And here's the important point. That same audience that a minute ago had booed burst into applause at that, and we got a louder round of applause than the boos had been, because when you speak the truth with a smile, it moves people's hearts and minds.
All right, so this is the last question. For those of you who submitted questions that I didn't get to, I am going to hand this off to Senator Cruz's staff so they have an opportunity to look at them. And if they have a chance to answer them later on other venues, they can do that as well. Very quickly, Senator, could you please expand on your flat tax proposal?
Absolutely. Right now, America spends about $500 billion on tax compliance, on lawyers, on accountants, on paperwork. It's all deadweight loss. That's about what we spend on our entire military budget. But as we like to say in Texas, it doesn't produce a single truck or tortilla. If we move to a flat tax, a simple flat tax. Now, I have not yet rolled out a specific rate and details. In the coming weeks and months, we will roll out a precise plan. What I have said is that it needs to be simple, flat, fair, apply to everyone, and be on a postcard. And actually, the most important factor of that is the postcard. Now, why is that? Because there are limits to physics. Look, what politicians love to do is add complexity. Here's how the most important reason for a flat tax is not the incredible economic growth it will generate, although that's hugely important. The most important reason is that it disempowers politicians in Washington. Why is that? Right now, here's how Washington works. A small businessman goes down to Washington, meets with his or her congressman. The elected member of Congress puts his arm around him and says, a small businessman says, can you help me out? The member of Congress says, sure. We can carve out a special provision in the tax code just for you. By the way, I've got a fundraiser on Tuesday. You're going to be there, right? And it's fundamentally corrupt. Do you know there are more words in the IRS code than there are in the Bible? Because it's filled with this carve-out and that carve-out, and it's how politicians shake down the private sector. Under a flat tax, the great thing is if you got a postcard, there's no more room on the postcard. And that means when someone goes to Washington, their member of Congress has to say, look, you're paying the same tax rate as everybody else. You just got to build a better mousetrap. And what that does is it takes power out of Washington and it brings it back to the private sector, to the citizenry, where it belongs.
Very good. That's all we have time for. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Senator Ted Cruz.
Thank you, and God bless you.